You'll get plenty of attention. That's right. You'll become the Rails developing every woman. I'm going to plug another class actually while I'm here. Nope. Off by a ladder. This is a class I'm teaching this fall. If anybody's interested. It's COM 333 now, I think. And there's a prereq, which is my web design class that I teach over in humanities, but I will waive anybody who's been through 361 or 362 with me to take that. So it's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be data-driven APIs, and we'll do Node.js in there. Fun things. Nobody's here, apart from you guys, who are the most important students. Ah, there's Jonathan. All right. It's 3:15, so there's no reason we can't start. So first is an announcement about Wednesday. I posted about this. Hey, Ori. I posted about this to Basecamp, but somebody will be coming from the ITM department to do a survey as part of the accreditation on Wednesday, like the first 15 minutes of class. So please make every effort to try to be here for that. That impacts ITM's accreditation, which impacts you in the long term because you want IIT to always be accredited so that nice shiny degree stays nice and shiny. Okay, so that'll be the first part of class on Wednesday. And like today, we probably won't go nearly the whole time. All right? I responded to everyone's draft project 3 things. So your site plans, your AV permissions form, and your scripts. One thing I just want to mention, because some of you in your scripts had turned them into more like little interviews or quizzes, it's important to listen to what your users have to say, but it's more important still to watch what they actually do. So in your scripts, you want to set them up. Hey, log in and add a class, or hey, log in and pay your balance, or whatever it is that you're doing. And then just kind of sit back and watch how they actually use the interface, because that's the most telling thing. All right? So that'll be good. I'm finishing up the comments and grades on Project 2, which again, since I've already commented on draft work, don't expect a huge tome from me about your Project 2. I've pretty much written feedback to you, but I'm going to try and finish those things before I go to bed tonight. I go to bed kind of late, so there's hope. Okay? All right, so parting material. This is kind of sad for me because like some of you, like Jingwen and Rosa and Ore, and Bobby, and Theo coming in, have been dealing with me since August. Right? There's the kindest way to put it. You've been dealing with me. So we've done a whole year of web design together, and it's ending in like, I don't know, 70 minutes or something like that of class time left. Today I want to do some capital R, capital T, real talk about frameworks and assessment and things like that, right? Because you are going to end up in a job or working as a freelancer or doing something where you may not have the luxury or the option of doing all of your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript yourselves. Most likely you will be asked to shop for or implement some kind of third-party framework. Fortunately, you have all the tools that you need after this year of studying the web to figure out what's going to work and what doesn't with these things. So if we make a pyramid of web languages, right? What's at the base of our pyramid? Thank you very much, Jonathan. HTML, right? And unfortunately, in too much of the rest of the world, the pyramid is completely inverted, right? This is HTML. Who cares about HTML? What? Snooze, language from the 1960s. Who cares? Right? And then some more CSS, but then we do JavaScript on the top, and we go crazy, right? With frameworks like React.js and some of the other villains that are not necessarily accessible or sustainable, all those other things. So, Stali method, standards-based design, we worry about HTML. Why does HTML, I mean, again, right, what was the original purpose, Theo, of HTML? Why was it invented?
To provide a framework for websites?
Yes, but it's even more specific than that. The original Tim Berners-Lee HTML 1.0, what was he trying to do? You got to think all the way back to August. What was the original, where was the original website, web server, and web page developed?
For the military, right?
Kind of. It was a research institute in...
You're talking about Berkeley? Or not Berkeley? Was it MIT?
Not MIT. CERN. Remember CERN? I forget. It's a French acronym, right? It's a nuclear research outfit. I believe in Switzerland. I could be wrong about that. Okay? And so the original HTML that Tim Berners-Lee developed, what was he trying? What did he want to mark up?
Pages?
What kind of pages? Say it again louder. No, not dynamic pages. It was way more primitive, knuckled. But remember, original HTML, there's no CSS, there's no JavaScript, right? What was he trying to mark up and make available to people?
Electronic documents?
Yes. And what kinds of electronic documents specifically would you get at a research institute?
White papers?
Yeah, well, or more specifically,
Research papers?
yeah, research papers, scientific research papers. So it's always important to remember that the vocabulary of HTML, even to this day with our fancy headers and footers and main and aside and all of that, the original tag set from HTML came from marking up scientific research papers. Now, of course, we've got lots of additional tags, and we've got things that weren't present in the earliest forms of HTML, like classes, like IDs, like data attributes and all of that. Why does HTML matter so much? Even if you're not doing scientific papers anymore, you're making the next greatest web application or whatever. Like, why does HTML matter? Theo?
Well, like, for simplicity reasons, it provides like a standard for like everyone.
Right. It's your baseline point of access, right? We can't ever guarantee that anybody's going to be able to access your CSS or your JavaScript, but we have to guarantee that they will access your HTML, right? Which is, again, why that HTML layer is so important. What do we use? Let's skip the CSS level. You know it's coming. How do we manipulate HTML via JavaScript? What's the little go-between? Starts with a D, rhymes with DOM, right? Some of you said that like you've never heard this before. DOM. What does DOM stand for? Holy cow, you guys, you're just trying to make me die up here. Slowly, painfully. What is the DOM? Trying so hard to drop a series of F-bombs again. I think I used them up the other day for like the next 2 years. Theo.
I dig up some notes, but I think, is it the document object model?
Yes. A document object model. And as you remember, the thing about the document object model is that is how any given browser or user agent more generally represents an HTML page to itself. It's what allows us to do things like, some class. We could do warning and then B, right? Your browser has to understand that there is something in the document called class warning, whatever element it might appear on, and that there's some B tag that appears inside of that thing. and then it can apply some style rules to it, right? We use JavaScript for the same thing to manipulate that. So when you are writing HTML, what you are doing is writing basically an API for whatever content it is that you're serving, right? Do we know this word API or this abbreviation? ITM majors, you should be jumping out of your chairs screaming at me what API expands to. You live, breathe, and dwell amongst APIs, whether you realize that that's what they are or not. TK? I know, it's the last week. Everybody's brain dead. You're all so screwed on your finals, aren't you? API. Thank you. Application Programming Interface, right? Oh. Right? So APIs come in many different flavors. Your favorite programming language, every built-in object and function and method, that's all part of the standard library API for the language that you're using, right? We get in JavaScript, part of its API is that there is a math object, and attached to that math object is a random method, right? Math random. You can write that in any JavaScript parsing environment on the planet. It's not going to be rand in one and R in another. It's always going to be random, so you always know that that thing is there waiting to be called, right? That's an application programming interface. Think back to the end of 361 if you had it with me, right? You hit data APIs. Remember that, where we were hitting like GitHub, pulling down username information, things like that? That's an API, right? Specifically, it's a data API. That there are particular URLs that GitHub publishes that we can request programmatically from, and it'll return a certain amount of data from us, right? My favorite API metaphor is from a guy named John Maida. Has anybody heard of John Maida before? Has anybody ever used an animated GIF? Okay, John Maida was the guy at MIT. Whoever said MIT earlier, here's your chance to say MIT. At MIT, created the animated GIF. But John Maida compares APIs to a phone book, right? Like if you had a phone book for everybody who worked at Google, all those big brains, and you could call up any one of those people and ask them to do your bidding, right? That's basically what an API is. It's some public registry that we can go and make requests to. So part of the reason that you don't want to skip or shortchange your HTML is it becomes the API for your entire app or document or site or whatever it is that you're building. HTML is the API. You rely on the API expressed by the DOM in both CSS and in JavaScript, right? Which is why I was always screaming and losing my mind every time I saw a break tag in somebody's HTML, right? It's not simple academic pedantry that you shouldn't use a break tag. It's that you're using a break tag someplace in your markup where there's a structural piece of information that's worth being able to access, right? You might have, you know, Chicago IL and drop a break tag here, right? And then 60616. You could do that. You'll get that rendered effect, but there's no way for you to programmatically now access this particular number there. So if we're doing a live update or we're changing a shipping information or something like that, now we have to deal with this whole entire blob here. Whereas if we do list items, right, we get our nice ability to run things on separate lines. But now there's a piece of semantic structure here, and if we add a class to this or we add an ID to this, then programmatically we have a much easier job styling it. We have a much easier job scripting it, doing all of these other things, all right? So HTML is really important that way. All right. CSS, what do you know about CSS? What was your personal, over the course of this year and probably right until this very moment based on the projects I've seen so far, what's your biggest personal struggle with CSS? Say it louder. Baseline grid. Okay, so that particular expression of CSS is still plaguing you, Aaron? That makes me sad, but I understand. It takes a while for those things to click in. Oh, no, I'm curious, like, what you have struggled with as somebody writing CSS. Baseline grid. Okay, if we can abstract a bit from baseline grid or column grid or any of that stuff, like, just as writing the language, regardless of what you're trying to express in CSS, what are you struggling with the most? Okay, organizing it. And where do you think those organization problems come from? Being not organized? Yes, that's usually a source of disorganization. Is it easier to organize a few things or a whole bunch of things? Yeah, a few things, right? One of the things that you will always see, right? Let's use one of these $5 stally words. Verbosity. We know what verbosity is? It's a back formation from an adjective verbose. Do we know what this means? If someone is verbose, I'm accused of it regularly. Yeah, they talk a lot, all the time, and won't shut up, right? So you can write code that's too verbose as well. And CSS is a language that it's very easy to get overly verbose in, right? How do you clean up your CSS so that it's not super verbose? What are some things built into the language that you can just use? Well, what do you mean by elements?
Anything we use is like color, background color.
Sure. All of your properties,
All of the, yeah.
right? So for something like padding, right? The verbose way to set your padding is to use all 4 of these padding properties, right? Padding left, padding right, top and bottom. Or you can use the shorthand padding property, right? But then you have a little bit more cognitive load as a writer. You have to remember if it's 4 values, it's top, right, bottom, left. If it's 2 values, it's top, bottom, right, left. Yes. I'm trying to do this in a mirror image in my head, and it's driving me crazy, right? So that's one way to do it. Another thing that Theo is getting at with elements, right, is to remember that we can do grouping selectors, right? We don't have to do separate style declarations for strong and B. We can just drop a comma between these two and style those things. Now, what a lot of, like, this sort of anti-pattern, have we heard this word before? This is a great word. Anti-pattern? So putting a break tag here is called an anti-pattern. It's usually something that you see done a lot that you should never do, right? So one of the anti-patterns that I've seen for years, I mean, this goes back to the earliest days of me teaching CSS. I still haven't figured out how to teach it well enough so this doesn't happen, is that someone will have, and here I'll just write some pseudocode, right? They'll have selector A, which has properties 1, 2, and 3. They'll have selector B, which has properties 1, 2, and 4. And then they'll have selector C, which has properties 1, 2, and 5, right? And so this leads to a big messy style. Does this anti-pattern look familiar? Anybody written this? Anybody looked at your own damn code? Because it's there. I guarantee you, right? So how do we clean this up? A, B, C, right? We set the patterns that they share. So 1 and 2 go there, right? Then B gets shrunk down to 4 is the thing it doesn't have, and C down to 5, right? And maybe we put 3 there, I don't know. Something like that, right? What's the fancy word I tried to introduce to you last week for when we go and rewrite something like this? Revise, but there's an even fancier programmer term for it. refactor, right? Again, when we're refactoring something, we're generally not disturbing the surface of the water, right? The design is going to look the same. The JavaScript is going to be behaving the same way. When we refactor, we're doing something like this, where we get rid of this super verbose, super messy, super hard to organize CSS, and instead we break it down so that we have our shared selectors there with 1 and 2. Then we do B gets its third property, and C gets its fourth, right? Because, Alejandro, would you not, I mean, I realize this is crazy truncated pseudocode that I'm writing on the board, but this suggests an organizational pattern, does it not? Here are the 3 elements that we're trying to style. They all share these properties, and then on these individual 2 elements here, they have some little variation or deviation from those things, right? So you get a little bit of organization that way. And of course, the other thing is to use the SMAX organizational pattern, right? What was SMAX again? Where do you start in a style sheet? Starts with B, rhymes with ace. Yeah, base. Right? Your base styles, and these are usually element selectors. Right? So your heading 1, generally what does it look like? Your heading 2, generally what does it look like? Okay? So that you had styles enough that without any classes or IDs or anything fancy, you would still have a more or less workable, readable page. Right? What's the next part of a SMAX page? SMAX way of organizing CSS? Starts with M, rhymes with module. Yeah, there you go. Module or modular styles, right? These are often classes, right? Because modular styles are little things that we would repeat over and over again, right? If we have some, rounded corner box with a little X control in it or something like that, that could be used all over the place. So we would put that in a modular style. Okay? And actually, I skipped one. I mean, you can do your modular ones next. I like to do my layout styles next. Right? These are usually, if you're doing landmark IDs, right? Your layout styles. Right? And this makes sense. We want to think about this. Here's another way to organize it, right? You could have the pedantic, nerdy, where would Stelly put it kind of thing. Or you could think about simple performance, right? The first line of a style sheet is the first line to get parsed, is the first line to get rendered, right? So what do we want rendered first? We want to have our base styles. How does a heading look? How does a paragraph look? How does a list item look? Boom, so it's there. Next thing, where does the stuff actually sit on the page? So we do our layout styles next. Third, what are these sort of clusters of things and how do they look? We do that fourth. What's our state, right? Which makes sense. We would put that towards the bottom because usually for our state styles, some JavaScript has to run. The whole DOM has to get loaded. So we don't want to stick our state styles up at the top because those will get rendered in part. Well, they'll get parsed. They won't get rendered until the state has actually been established by JavaScript. But we put that towards the bottom. And then the last one, which we didn't talk about in this class at all, is theme styles, right? So if you have an app that allows people to choose their favorite colors for their profile page or something like that, then we could do these theme styles at the very bottom of the page.
That would be like user-oriented, like customization?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. So something like your Twitter page where you can choose a background image or a set of colors or something like that. We would express that somehow down here, right? Which might actually be coupled in some ways with state styles or modular styles, depending on what you're doing. Going a step further, if you decide that you want to try to make money by selling WordPress themes or Tumblr themes or stuff like that, you could have all kinds of different options and customizations based on what somebody selects. Ori, did you have a question? Oh, I thought I heard a voice coming from your direction as I started yakking again. And then I rudely finished, but I also knew that if I didn't finish just that second, I would forget what I was saying. All right? And finally, the one that everybody is still complaining, I don't know JavaScript. Back to the drawing board for me for next year to see how to do even more JavaScript. What's your biggest problem with JavaScript? Okay, Aaron, you said something about jQuery?
I just said it upsets me because it's just because when I like look up something, they'll tell me like four ways to do it, and it's really usually the fifth way that I want.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're onto something there, right? That there's only one way in HTML to express a paragraph tag. That's it, right? Now, people will use div tags and do other horrible things to mimic that, but if we're talking about the language of HTML, it's highly constrained, it's highly specific. Now, if we want to color that paragraph red in CSS, how many different ways can we color this paragraph tag red in CSS? There's a bunch, right? We could say color, colon, and then write out red, red. We could do color, 900, so we've got a hexadecimal representation of red. We could do RGB, sRGB, right? So you start to get these degrees of freedom. That's just for something like color, right? If we want to move something to the left by 3 ems, how could we do that? Okay, we could do padding. What else could we do? Margin. If it's just one line of text, we could use the text indent property. If we're talking about a positioned block in CSS, we could use the left property and actually move the whole block over, right? This is what gets more challenging about these languages, is that when you have a really highly constrained, highly specific vocabulary like HTML, there's usually only a couple good answers. Get something a little bit more complex like CSS, it's even more answers, right? And then, of course, with JavaScript, and especially when you start introducing something like jQuery or Angular or underscore or whatever JavaScript framework it is that you want, then you get all of the different possible methods in the language itself, plus all the other methods that the framework is bringing to you, right? So if we want to slide something off to the left in JavaScript, how many different ways are there to do that? A lot, right? jQuery has native JavaScript methods of sliding things off to the left, right? We don't want to generally use those because they're computationally expensive and they're not as smooth as CSS transitions and things like that. But Aaron's point is well taken, that as we go up here, there's lots of different ways to program the exact same thing. Which one do you choose, Rosa? Or we could ask Aaron, when you see 5 different ways to do something and the 5th is the one that you're really looking for, how do you know that that's the one you're looking for?
They'll usually have an example of how they implement it.
Okay.
That's kind of how I want to implement it, or if not, just trial and error.
Sure. So implementation examples. Most of us will go for simplicity. If you see somebody who's done something in 20 lines of JavaScript and somebody else who's done the same thing in 3 lines of JavaScript, most of us will opt for the 3 lines of JavaScript, right? Or doing that method. But how do you, as somebody who's writing JavaScript, Rosa, what do you go for in your own code that you're writing? Or do you just do trial and error and hope for the best? Hope, of course, has a pretty limited API when it comes to programming. The Hope class. It's a joke. Everybody's going to laugh anytime now. Okay? What's the thing that you should value most, especially when you're writing in a brand new language? Right, there'll be total performance hits like, oh man, you shouldn't use a for loop, like that'll, that uses so much more memory than a straight up while loop or something like that. How do you make, seriously, Theo, like people are like that. Total gearheads, like I would never use this particular construct in this language because there's so much wasted overhead, blah, 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 blah. Say it louder.
Check the documentation.
Well, you want to check the documentation. But I'm talking about you as a, right, this is the thing we talk about least when it comes to programming languages. You as a human being with needs and feelings and a bedtime and whatever else it is that makes up your day. If you can write the same idea half a dozen, 2 dozen different ways, what's the best way to write it when you're first writing it? You say what?
The simplest way?
Maybe the simplest way, but most of us don't get to the simplest way of doing something our first try. Matt?
The way you understand
Yes, right? In your first draft of code, go for intelligibility, right? Let me use another $5 style word. Intelligibility, Theo, right? Y'all get a invoice at the end of the semester for me for all my expensive words. Intelligibility, right? I do that a lot when I'm writing code in class like I do. I don't necessarily write it the super simplest way or the super speediest way. I write it in a way so that we can all look at it together and go, that's what it's doing, right? Because again, take advantage of the fact that you're in an educational environment, and so you don't have to worry about getting to performance right away or getting to the simplest method right away. Learn the simpler ones. And then the other aspect of it is to study code, right? Most of us only read code like when we're panicked at 5 minutes to deadline and we're on Stack Overflow trying to go through somebody's cryptic JavaScript and figure out what it is that they're doing. And then, of course, we cargo cult that stuff all into our own script, right? We want to actually look at how this stuff is written. Which brings me to Bootstrap. My brother's a professional developer. I think he's at Sprout. I can't remember where he is. Someplace in Chicagoland. He's a Python guy. And the first time I taught 362 a year ago, I was talking about like how I had to steer so many students away from Bootstrap, and my brother, the developer's response was, Bootstrap, isn't that what you use when you don't have a class like human-computer interaction and web design? I was like, yeah, Okay, so let's say this is on the table. This is, some shop you're working at. You're going to use Bootstrap, or you're trying to assess whether you're going to use Bootstrap or something like that. Like, how do you go about assessing this thing? Or do you go by brand name? Like, oh, Bootstrap, I heard of Bootstrap before, we should use Bootstrap. Right? There's so much brand name addiction out there. People are like, oh, we should use Drupal. Oh, I've heard of Drupal. Yeah, me too. Oh, we should use Drupal. Or WordPress, or Rails, or whatever the brand du jour is, right? How do you assess something like this? Okay, that's a good measuring stick, right? Does this work good against your situation? But how are you going to know whether something works good or works bad? Okay, we should do some testing. Testing is going to be a problem because you've got to write a whole bunch of stuff before you can actually test it, right? What else might we do? Okay, definitely we've got to do some research, right? What kind of research would we do before we go off to write the next great web application?
Is it compatible with your environment?
Compatible with the environment? Even before that, right? Good old-fashioned sketches, right? We're doing an app, and it's going to be a flashcard app, and it's going to have, some subject on the top, and it'll have some question, and you try to answer the question, and it flips over, and you see the answer on the other side, right? That could be an app. I'm sure that is an app someplace, okay? The problem is that people will look at their little set of requirements and say, oh, yeah, huge, towering project, my little Venn diagram here, like this set of things is inside of that. So let's go ahead and let's use all of Bootstrap, or let's use all of Drupal, right? The number of academics I know who use WordPress for every last website that they ever make and then get pharma hacked, right? Prominent academics, high pay grade academics who have pharma hacks on their websites, right? There's a guy, have anybody ever heard of this guy? I love to shame this guy every time I get the chance because so many people think like he's so great. Clay Shirky. Oh, it looks like he finally cleaned it up. No, he did not clean it up. Clay Shirky, buy Viagra, buy generic Cialis, right? And this guy is held up as like a big public intellectual, liberal arts, digital blah, blah, blah kind of guy, right? His site is hacked. He's advertising Viagra every time some graduate student somewhere is Googling this guy before writing a seminar paper or something like that, right? That's because he's got WordPress running on Shirky.com and did not keep it updated, so his database has been compromised with what's known as a pharma hack. It's called a pharma hack because it's used to peddle pharmaceutical things. What's really surprising here to me, and maybe this is just because of my ad blocker or something, typically Google has a warning here that says this site might be compromised when it has all this stuff. That's what I was actually looking for. Okay? The reason most academics I know who are not technical people, the reason they use WordPress is they just want to repeat their navigation over multiple pages. Right? Which is not an easy thing to do. It's not possible at all to do in HTML, right? If we have some repeating content, right? We have a nav element, and we've got an unordered list inside of that thing, right? To repeat this chunk of HTML on every single page, there's no native way in HTML to do that. You can try to force it in JavaScript, but the problem with that is Google and other spiders that don't render your JavaScript are not going to be able to see your navigation, and if they can't see your navigation, they can't index your site. If they can't index your site, you can't sell people Viagra on the side. Or whatever it is, right? So the sort of like, does it solve our problem model where there's like, yes, here's this huge towering framework, here's your requirement stack inside of this. You have to weigh. What does it mean to implement some huge solution that does 1,000 more things that we don't actually need done against your little set of requirements? Right? So we could look at this further. We could look at, I always skip past the get started thing because those are always way simpler than what life is actually going to be like. Oh, you just include the script tag in your thing and it's fine. Right? Let's get down to business, like components. Right? A dozen reusable components to provide iconography, drop-downs, input. I mean, when you see a sentence like this, it should give you pause, right? It's like those TV infomercials, if you watch those late at night. Like, if you order now, you'll get the polymer remover, the scratch remover, blah, 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 you know, and they list a whole bunch of things. But, oh, wait, there's more, right? And you go in the next 10 minutes, you're going to get all these other things, right? Lots of people love big lists of features. I really dislike big lists of features, right? Because odds are I'm not going to need iconography and drop-downs and input groups and navigation and all of these other things. I'll need one or two of those. But if you buy into a system like this, you're buying into it whole cloth, right? Which is why, Rosa, I know you're sitting there, you're trying to point out my own hypocrisy, which is a good thing to do because like I am a major hypocrite, right? Versus something like Modernizer, right? You've seen me use Modernizer before. You can get a development build of Modernizer, or you can do what we did, which is to say, what are we actually using, right? We don't have to have the ambient light event tests if we're not using that stuff. If all we want to do is check for Flexbox, let's grab that one test and run with it. Right? So I love stuff like this that's modular, that doesn't require buy-in to the whole framework. I just want the test for is Flexbox supported or whatever like that. Okay, so we've got all these available glyphs from glyph icons, right? What else? Components. I want to see. Where do they have their crazy columns? Is that in CSS? Okay, yeah. Here are these roads to hell kind of thing, right? So here in Bootstrap are our column classes, which we get by dropping in a class of col MD -1, which stands for what? Anybody want to take a guess? Col probably stands for column. MD, in my world, that stands for markdown, but I'm guessing that's not what they're after here. Col MD1. MD8, MD4, right? I mean, look at all these things. There's all these different numbers on them. And yet on this page, they're all taking up the whole width of it. Look at this. I mean, this should make you just horrified, right? This whole mess of div tags with these cryptic classes in them. That's the other part of giant frameworks, is that they try to be all things to all people. And if they are trying to be all things to all people, they have to be highly abstract, right? I'm not blaming Bootstrap that they don't have a, primary content and contact and other kinds of classes or IDs in there. That's impossible to do because of what they're trying to do with their framework, right? And of course, it gets uglier and crazier. So here's our flexible mobile and desktop. So now if we want to do our mobile and desktop columns, we can do things like col XS12 and col MD8.
Is that like sizing? Is it like extra small?
Right, and you're doing one class for how you want the columns to be arranged at mobile scale, and you're doing another class for how you want them to be at desktop scale. And if you keep going down this document, you'll see that it gets even crazier. Mobile, tablet, and desktop. So now we're doing col XS12, col SM6, col MD8. Right? Good, Matt. You're shaking your head. That's the best thing I've seen in this class all year, is somebody going like, hell no. Right? You know better than this. We don't want to send HTML classes to do the job of CSS and a good set of media queries. Because here's the thing. If you say, well, Bootstrap is responsive now, you look at it, it's actually not responsive. This is adaptive web design, where at certain breakpoints, everything kind of shifts around. Right? This is different from what we've been doing. And of course, oh man, it's like the makers of Bootstrap are like, what would make Stally burst a vein in his head? Let's write that, right? Like div class row, col XS9, and then we've got break tags thrown in here for good measure, right? Okay, but again, you don't have to take my word for it and my strong set of opinions, right? Do you want to inherit this code base? Do you want to be tracking down, ooh, we accidentally wrote col MD8 instead of col XS6 in the HTML? No, right? That's not going to bring you innovation. That's not going to create a better user experience. It's going to lock you into this particular framework, right? Because let's admit, when you write classes like this, you are writing those classes for the sake of CSS. It should be the exact opposite. We want to write the classes for the sake of the content or the feature or whatever it is that we're marking up, and then use those classes or those IDs, or those structural relationships as hooks so that we can do our styling and that we can do our JavaScript or do whatever these things are that we want to do. Okay? Whew. All right, so we do that, but let's say we're undeterred, like, oh, I can live with that. So what else do you want to do as a developer? I want to find the thing's GitHub repo, right? And the first thing I look at, especially when I'm wandering into unfamiliar waters, Chingwen, is to look and see when was the latest commit done on this project, right? You find some awesome sounding framework or command line tool or something, and then you find it and then discover that the most recent commit to it was 3 years ago. Should you use it? I don't know. Depends on what it is. If it's some low-level library that's not going to change much, maybe that's okay. Bootstrap here is obviously changing quite a bit. And they do have a distribution, right? Are we familiar with this? Like, this is when I start to, like, not wanting to bore anybody. What does it mean that a lot of repositories have a build directory and a dist directory and a docs? You could probably figure out what docs is, right? You might find a lib directory. Where do those come from? Do we know what's in dist? Distribution? And what would you expect in the distribution directory? Versus something like build, or if we had one called lib, or bin sometimes. Might be the versions. But usually what we find in the dist directory, this is probably what is being offered for download on the GitHub site, right? Their big download Bootstrap thing. That when you download Bootstrap, you're probably downloading the version of Bootstrap that's given out for distribution. When you distribute code, it's usually minified, right? Which means it might be obfuscated. Bootstrap uses sassy CSS, right? If we go back to their repository, they have this SCSS directory. And we can see that they've put all of their different features into its own SCSS file. I can tell you as somebody who writes SCSS that when you see an underscore followed by a name, that's a partial, that there's probably some larger file, probably the entire Bootstrap CSS is just going to be a whole bunch of require statements or import statements. Yeah, so import custom variables, mix in tables, blah, 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 blah. The actual Bootstrap SCSS file has no content in it other than to import all of these partials. All right, so if we want to actually look at what they're doing, let's see if we can find, like, do the pagination, modal mix-ins, media, custom. Where are they putting their columns? Custom forms. Probably grid here, huh? Enable grid classes. Yeah, so then we have to check, we have to run down through their functions here to figure that stuff out, right? So these things get very complex. At this point, what you might want to do is actually go and download this, or rather clone this project and compile the SCS yourself and see what it's actually outputting. Because if we go and look at the actual build CSS, oh, they're nice. They do have both a minified version, right? Here's grid min CSS. It's one line that goes on for 10 miles, right? So if we look at grid CSS by itself, we should see a less obfuscated thing. Okay? So what kinds of stuff do you see right away that should be making you chafe a little bit, responsive designers? Matt? Oh, you were just scratching. All right. Pixel units, right? Padding right, padding left, 15 pixels. Okay. Aaron, if you want to implement your baseline grid, now you're thinking, well, do we want to do this in multiples of 15 pixels? Right? Container. Right, and again, like this is, look at this. Min width 768, container, padding right, padding left, 15 pixels. Min width 992, container, padding right, padding left, 15 pixels. 1200, container, padding right, padding left, 15 pixels. Right? We get it all the way down to 576 like that, and then here's our outside of any media query one. They've written that one set of styles, what, 5 different ways? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like that. Right? And that's a performance problem. Because now you're asking all of your users, even if this has been minified, right? You're still downloading all of this extra cruft. And this is just baseline stuff. We haven't even gotten any of the exotic properties where they're building, you know, what it means for col XS4 or whatever these things are. We're just talking about a simple container. All right, here's our container fluid. What was I talking about, right? Container fluid. Let's repeat these styles again, shall we? 15 pixels. 15 pixels, 15 pixels, 15 pixels, 15 pixels, right? Over and over and over again. No one seems as horrified or troubled by this as I do. You're probably all just more worried about what you're doing this week. Right? Okay, now finally we get to the Stack O selectors, right? We'll congratulate them for this. That they are doing all of these grouping selectors, right? Here are all of these different columns. They're all going to be positioned relatively. They're all going to have a width of 100%, which is interesting. They're going to have a min height of a pixel. And then we're going to start setting more padding left, padding right on them. But then look, the same story is being told here. We're replacing all of these selectors, 15, 15. All these selectors, 15, 15. All of these selectors, 15, 15, right? Matt? I don't know. We would have to look at their build tools. We would have to look at what's going on there, but that makes no sense at all, right? Because that's how we want to use media queries is to, especially, I mean, give them credit, right? They're using min-width media queries. This should be nice mobile-first design. And they're completely blowing the advantage of that because they're repeating all of these styles over and over and over and over again, right? All right, so then we've got, looks like they're implementing Flexbox here, okay, with sad clown face, right, because there's no kind of test. We're not doing Modernizer or something to see if a browser can actually render Flexbox. We're just going to do a bunch of prefixed vendor things here, right? And now we're finally starting to see here are some nice percentage-based units for all of these different widths, column 6. And then we've got these pull classes, right? Which I think, and this is also puzzling, right? All of this is happening outside of any media query, right? So column 1 is 8.3333%, including on a tiny mobile phone screen, which might be fractions of a pixel, depending on how big the column is and what its context is, right? And again, I'm willing to bet that you and I, standing here in this classroom just now, have looked at more of the Bootstrap source code than have 95% of the people who have used Bootstrap on a project. And we've looked through one part of one file, right? We've still got a long way to go. How many thousand lines are on this thing? 17, 19, okay, we got about 2,000 lines of code, and that's just for the column grid stuff. Who knows about the iconography and the drop-downs and the field sets and all the other stuff, right? And again, this is an economic issue. If you have mobile users or a mobile target group, and you use something like Bootstrap, and it's not carefully treated like this, you're going to burn through your mobile users' data plan just so they can load up your website. That's before they even hand over their credit card information or anything like that. You're sending down all of this stuff. Now, they've done a really good job of minifying Bootstrap, but even if you're minifying lots of code, you're doing a lot of serious processor overhead, which on somebody who has an older phone, a not-so-good phone, or whatever it is, right? All of that minified code still has to be parsed, and it still has to be rendered, and it might grind their device to a halt, right? So, which is all just to say, in our crazy Venn diagram fried egg thing, right? Your requirements being satisfied as a fractional subset of some larger set of requirements is not a good way to proceed. We want to start by doing this kind of thing, where we sketch this out. And we say, here's what our little app is going to do, and these are the things that we need, and this is how we're going to write it, right? Because even if it's somebody else's project, right, you bring in Bootstrap, or you bring in WordPress, or you bring in Drupal, or whatever the framework is, you own that, right? The second you commit that thing to your repository at work, it's your problem. Your users are not going to care that there was some broken package upstream in a grunt task runner or something like that that screwed up your project. It's your problem, right? Okay. That's enough of a sermon and preaching for today. I think I've lost most of you already anyway, which is okay. It's the last week. You can go back and review the tape from the beach this summer or whatever. All right? Okay, Wednesday, and I'm going to say this to the people at home. Well, if you're at home because you're online, don't come. But if you're supposed to be here Wednesday for that accreditation survey, and then we'll do a quick wrap-up where I'll try to show you how I would actually go about building my own framework using a tiny little framework that I indeed have built and tried to use to support a book. All right? Okay, I'll see you Wednesday. Good luck this week. Better luck next week. Ha ha, yes. Sorry, I just pinched myself real bad. Yeah, I'm okay.
So I wanted to show you kind of an update of our project.
Okay.
Does this look okay so far? This is our map. And it auto-tracks your location. Right
Sure.
away. I know I kind of messed up. So
Yeah.
is our